everyone, and welcome to this talk sponsored by the Center for Comparative and Transnational Laws, Transnational Legal History Group. My name is Laila Vivina, and I am an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at CUHK. So today our speaker is Professor Fadila Yahaya, a historian from the National University of Singapore. And Professor Yahaya received her PhD in history from Princeton University in 2012. She specializes in legal history, histories of Southeast Asia, Islamic law, mobilities, and the Indian Ocean. And her amazing book, Fluid Jurisdictions, Colonial Law and Arabs in Southeast Asia, was published by Cornell University Press last year, and is a fascinating and really insightful look at how the Arab diaspora navigated the legal law and legal plurality within English and Dutch colonialism in Southeast Asia. So today her talk emerges from her second book on the history of land reclamation in the British Empire and is entitled Shifting Sands: History of Land Reclamation in Hong Kong in the 20th Century. And after the talk, I will moderate questions. So please send me your questions via the chat box. And I guess afterwards also you can use the raise hand function. So a big welcome today to Professor Yahaya. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, the Center for Comparative and Transnational Law within the Faculty of Law at Chinese University of Hong Kong for inviting me today, especially to Christopher and Laila. And thank you to Laila for the introduction as well. In so much as land reclamation is the formation of new land from areas that were once underwater, Hong Kong is indeed no stranger to such projects, being intensively subjected to it since its inception as a British colony in 1841. A destructive blaze in Sheung Wan in northwest Hong Kong in 1851 destroyed 450 houses and killed 200 Chinese and 2 British. In the wake of the disaster, the British combined the rubble with debris from hill slopes and deposited it in Victoria Harbour to build a 50-foot wide road by the waterfront. 50 years later, overcrowded conditions led the Armenian businessman Kachik Paul Chater, who founded property developer company Hong Kong Land, to propose intense projects of land reclamations that led to the reclamation of 59 acres of land in the colony between 1889 and 1903 to run from Whitty Street in Saiwan. Till the early 20th century, the cost of reclamation in Hong Kong was relatively low, made out of rock and soil found in abundance near the sites of reclamation themselves, and the depth of water being filled being relatively small. Over the decades, land reclamation in Hong Kong became progressively expensive because fills are not easily available anymore, and the sea to be reclaimed had even greater depths. Not only that, the materiality of land reclamation changed drastically in that the sand used is no longer found in the natural landscape adjacent or close to reclamation sites. Chater's land reclamation project formed a precursor to yet larger projects launched by the British colonial government in the 1920s, 30s, and 50s that this paper will focus on. As of 2016, around 6% of Hong Kong's total area is reclaimed land, amounting to 7,000 hectares that accommodates 27% of the city's population and as much as 70% of Hong Kong's commercial activities. Land reclamation is part of a larger history of control over natural resources and territory. And on this map, which I got from this website, the darker the color, the older the reclaimed land is. Yeah. Through this process, places are intentionally terraformed through huge earthworks. Currently, the process takes on world-making dimensions in places like China, Singapore, the Arab Gulf states, and so on, to the extent of characterizing the Anthropocene, the present geological epoch. Land reclamation intensified in the early 20th century when most of the world was under colonial rule. As a solution to thorny territorial jurisdictional issues, overpopulation in coastal areas, need for expansion of harbor facilities, imperial powers had always been keen on harnessing the powers of technology that would enable them to traverse the immense ocean unimpeded by nature or politics. The largest imperial power by this time, Britain, with its maritime proclivities, had already conquered the sea through the navy. One method that had not been explored is through land reclamation. Through land reclamation, colonial acquisitiveness arrived at a literal solution rather than occupation of more land. As a colonial port city in the early 20th century, Hong Kong is a complex and ongoing process, one that continually requires physical infrastructure to support the population, experts, engineers, and laborers to build the infrastructure, and people to operate that physical infrastructure eventually. Land which forms territory is the basic unit of infrastructure that in turn undergirds all other critical infrastructure, without which a society cannot be healthy or an economy prosperous. Because land reclamation tended to expand territory out to sea, they were theoretically unbounded projects, reaching infinitely out into space without firm territorial sovereignty. They represented the economic, physical, and symbolic power of the colonial regime. It is no wonder that colonial officials projected their fantasies onto these projects. A blank slate was the ultimate goal of colonial officials, and what better embodiment was there other than reclaimed land, which formed the materiality of the colony. The process of land reclamation planted deeper territorial roots by expanding colonial jurisdiction into the sea and reinforced colonial hegemony in the region beyond land territory. In this way, colonial land reclamation was nothing short of colonialism at its height, with a new physical territory as its edifice. By design, land reclamation compels usage due to the high costs. Territory produced through the process of land reclamation had to fulfill its intended function. Since its purpose was predetermined in order to justify the high cost of reclamation, chances of disconnect between intention and fulfillment of reclaimed land was relatively low compared to other infrastructure projects. Conveniently, the territory is alienated land by default, and therefore an ideal colony within a colony, markedly different from adjoining unreclaimed territory, which formed the primary site of colonial occupation. Urbanized coasts bred yet even more urbanization, because the latter often arose near waterfronts and spread inwards very quickly in many places. There seemed to be no more space to expand, while still being near the ports and docks, in that it simultaneously consists of the conquest of maritime space and the production of new territory. While theft of watery spaces were not immediately apparent to even those who depended on water for their livelihoods, because people rarely owned bodies of water compared to landed property. Theft of land was very familiar, of course, and urgent to landowners. Here we see the limits of the powers of local colonial governments, occasionally weak in themselves, subject to control by the British Imperial government in London in the form of various offices, primarily the Colonial Office and the Foreign Office. In 1935, agencies as varied as the Secretary of State, the Foreign Office, and the China Association came together to prevent the Hong Kong government from interfering with land rights for the purpose of executing public works, especially land reclamation. The Hong Kong government had drafted a bill in 1932, giving itself general powers to reclaim land and to build piers and breakwaters, warehouses, and other public works on the foreshores and seabed of the colony. So it's really extensive powers. And to extinguish all private rights of access, to remove any piers, wharves, or landing places subject to compensation determined by a judge. Because the bill could possibly affect the property and shipping of British subjects outside the colony, the bill was sent to the Legislative Council in London. Owners of property immediately behind the foreshore area were mainly private corporations for the longest time, such as Butterfield and Swire and Jardine Matheson, and a few other property owners who became concerned about the value of their property due to changes to their immediate environment, and not to mention logistical difficulties, because now ships can't go up to the go down anymore, as close to go down anymore. More importantly, they feared the possible loss of sea frontages. So this is what they feared the most: access that their go-downs and wharves would have to the sea vessel if the government were to build new piers, warehouses, and ferry services to compete with existing private operators. So here on this slide, we see the go down of Jardine Matheson from the late 19th century in the background over there. And it is often rendered in illustrations, paintings of colonial Hong Kong. These property owners, such as the Jardine Matheson Company, already resented that seawater was seriously polluted due to the inflow of construction waste and effluent released during the process of building artificial land. And this did not take place, in a matter of like a few years, but a matter of decades. This not only pointed to a perceived disjoint between the interests of long-established dock companies and the government, who apparently reclaimed land rather haphazardly without considering potential problems. It also demonstrates a lack of trust between the established business sector, which is very powerful in Hong Kong historically, and the Hong Kong government, whose interests evidently did not align with the former's aims. Although private business interests were often aligned with or supplemented public infrastructure, their interests were pitted against public interest by government representatives, a symptom of ongoing resentment. In the 30s, these private companies suggested that a special ad hoc ordinance be passed every single time a specific public work was planned that could interfere with private land rights. This ordinance would carefully respond to planned works 2 years in advance and determine amount of compensation for themselves and also for other private property owners. This request met with sympathy within the Colonial Office in London, but the government in Hong Kong did not like it. Reclamation enthusiasts were thereafter reined in by the Public Reclamation Validation and Clauses Ordinance in 1936, which validated past works because it already happened, but did not grant the Hong Kong government power to undertake similar works in the future. Any public works that the Hong Kong government wished to undertake was henceforth dealt with by Treasury and the Foreign Office in London, as well as the China Association, which is an association of British merchants, on a case-by-case basis. The ordinance was not without controversy, since the Foreign Office was worried that the government of China might seize upon it to take riparian land, so land that abuts the rivers and any body of water, acquired by British concerns in China for the express purpose of enjoying and developing the trading facilities afforded by access to water. So this is part of the agreement, and an interpretation of this clause could be expensive in the eyes of the government. I mean the Hong Kong government. So they're always careful about water bodies because they are afraid that China might claim that as their jurisdiction. Here we see the matter of jurisdiction being an issue. One of the main consequences of land reclamation was increased proximity between neighbors, which led to increased friction everywhere across the world. The prohibitive cost of land reclamation projects made it a recourse of last resort compared to other infrastructure projects. Being massive geoengineering projects, land reclamation efforts were extremely expensive and often completely debt financed. Land reclamation efforts were extremely expensive and therefore formed risky undertakings involving huge volumes of sand, specialized equipment and vehicles, costly research into the stability of soil and with its peculiar characteristics, labor, logistical coordination, and resettlement of people who were adjacent to reclamation sites, either because they live there, or because they work there, they depend on their livelihood, they depend on the sea, for example, for their livelihood, and so on and so forth. Less infrastructure costs spun out of control in the colonies, reclamation projects were subjected to extra scrutiny by British Imperial authorities in London to keep in check land reclamation efforts, because it's hugely expensive and they didn't want their people to go out of control and be land reclamation happy. Every time you need more land, you reclaim land. That's just inefficient in terms of money. In Hong Kong, the initial projected amount for land reclamation schemes to last from 1948 to 1952, the post-war period when land reclamation was really intense, focused on Hung Hom Bay and Connaught Road Central in Victoria Harbour, was estimated to be a hefty 3 million British pounds in April 1948. In this case, the most immediate drive for land reclamation was coastal sediment dynamics, because the coast had changed at this time, because it's been 100 years since land reclamation began in Hong Kong, and it changed the ecology of and the coastline environment of the coastal environments of Hong Kong. The area around the bay was full of rubble from buildings which had been destroyed also during the Japanese occupation, which ended in 1945. The rubble was in danger of being washed into the harbor, choking it with debris. Reclamation of the bay could cover an area of 93 acres on which full-scale housing and industrial development was estimated to be 20 million Hong Kong dollars or 1.25 million pounds, according to the governor of Hong Kong, Alexander Grantham, more than the projected 18 million Hong Kong dollars, which is 1.125 pounds on reclamation of the bay. The second scheme, estimated to cost 14 million Hong Kong dollars or 875,000 pounds, consisted of a construction of a dock, 100 feet wide and 3,500 feet long, and a total of 9 piers for the use of river and coastal cargo and passenger vessels in 2 separate sections to relieve traffic congestion on the island waterfront. Colonial officials in Hong Kong worked hard to obtain financial support from the Colonial Development Corporation, the CDC, who was in charge of colonial development and welfare scheme, but anticipated lukewarm responses at best, because Britain was also recovering from the war, and also land reclamation is hugely expensive to begin with. Against all odds, Grantham requested for an interest-free loan or loan at a low interest rate from the Colonial Development and Welfare Scheme funds, repayable from the proceeds of sale of land in the case of Hung Hom and by sinking fund in the case of Connaught Road Central. Try, his colleagues scrawled to the Secretary of State for the Colonies, the highest authority in charge of land reclamation projects in Hong Kong, urging his colleague not to lose heart. True enough, confirmation of the impossibility of CDC financing came swiftly in June 1948, since they only had a mere 120 million pounds at their disposal in total granted by the Treasury, who control actual disbursement. Out of desperation, recourse to private enterprise was floated as a suggestion by the Hong Kong government, as well as was the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, newly established by the United Nations in 1944 and became operational in 1946. And this bank oversaw land reclamation projects in Korea and other places. The latter was considered a weak option since land reclamation projects were not likely to be deemed productive according to the IBRD's own stipulation. But as I said, they did fund other land reclamation projects elsewhere. A third alternative for financial resources for land reclamation projects was the state lottery, which would make land reclamation a truly homegrown effort. So this state lottery was controversial. The Hong Kong government thought it would be potentially popular in Hong Kong due to what the British government racistly termed Chinese mentality, which was attracted to, and I quote, the side gambling element. Racist stereotypes aside, the practice was generally frowned upon by British imperial authorities elsewhere as an expedient that deceived colonial populations, according to them, into thinking that a pleasant and easy source of revenue had been found, and that more positive and less palatable methods are therefore unnecessary. And this is what the British officials said to each other, like, we shouldn't do this because it will make Hong Kongers think that it's so easy to get money. Every time you need a project, you can just have a state lottery. Although British subjects in Hong Kong were potentially direct stakeholders in the land reclamation projects, of course, they were denied the opportunity to directly finance land reclamation in the colony, as if collaboration with subject populations could potentially deepen the latter's hold over British territory, thus weakening British authority. The Hong Kong government, in fact, made sure of this more than 100 years before. In August 1843, exactly a year after the Treaty of Nanjing formally cemented the status of Hong Kong as a British Crown colony, the British Land Committee determined that the monopoly of the colonial government in land supply be applied to the sea surface for reclamation as well. So to deny Hong Kongers any claims to land on land proper, it will be incongruous to not extend it to reclaimed land as well, or potential reclaimed land. While on mass, that was their rationale. While on mass financing of costly reclamation projects by the majority of colonial subjects were frowned upon, there were signs that wealthy colonial subjects were allowed, even encouraged to contribute. In 1930, a man named Chung Ah-Sharp, whose father reserved reclamation rights in 1900 while selling his property to the Hong Kong government, applied for an ex gratia grant, a payment made out of a sense of moral obligation rather than a legal requirement, because the Hong Kong government was not required to pay him any compensation, but he applied for this out of to appeal to their sense of moral obligation. But this is colonial time, so a sense of moral obligation is, what does that even mean? His application arose out of the Praia East Reclamation Scheme, which commenced in 1921, partly financed by Paul Chater. Section 41C of the Praia East Reclamation Ordinance allowed persons who, although were not owners of the land, the right to participate in any such reclamation scheme. So there was a way for super wealthy Hong Kongers to do that, Chinese Hong Kongers to partake in this reclamation schemes. But it was a very select few people, because they had to be super wealthy. Although the younger Chung failed to enter into the participation agreement himself before the period lapsed, which was a period of 3 months, he was allowed to opt in again, which indicated that funds were still important to the effort, of course. These rights allowed him or his heir to own frontage property if reclamation went through, and this is what everybody wants. Chung claimed that he left Hong Kong in 1907. Had he remained, he said, he would have been apprised of the reclamation project and dutifully entered into the participation agreement, because his father was a party, right, into this decades-long reclamation project. Instead, it was only in 1929 that he learned of it and applied retrospectively to participate in the scheme. This amounted to a proposal to pay the government his supposed share. The problem was that in 1921, the property was worth only $32,800. But in 1929, after reclamation was complete, the same property was valued at $120,000. It must be remembered that Chung escaped all the burdens of outlay and other anxieties of the scheme. Governor William Peel warned the Secretary of State for the Colonies, Lord Parsfield. Therein lies the rub. The case of Chung revealed that it was not simply sharing the cost with colonial subjects that made colonial government uncomfortable. It was that colonial subjects, especially within the, for example, in this manner or within the state lottery scheme, could not possibly share the burden of anxieties and risks that government authorities had. So there's that unfairness, like, oh, he's trying to benefit from this now that the land is worth so much, but he didn't partake in the risk. So why should he benefit from the whatever transpired, right? Whatever that came out of it. So they saw colonial subjects, including rich ones, as potential freebooters. Naturally, anxiety amongst private financiers, the Hong Kong government and British government in London mounted as reclamation projects got underway, because the cost increased exponentially from month to month sometimes. Understandably, because of the high cost, abandoned projects were common and had real repercussions for governments and investors alike throughout the world. Although it must be emphasized that the latter group was rarely consulted before alterations to government projects were made, which meant that they were likely even more disadvantaged, because it's all in the hands of the British government in Hong Kong and the British government based in London. The government could easily manipulate local investors to build and invest more, because they could easily get away with dropping projects on a whim with little consequences for themselves, because they determine the law and compensation. In 1930, a case involving Kwek Jun Eng or Kwok Chun Yung, the multi-millionaire sugar king of Java, appeared on the docket. He was primarily a speculative trader, and also, of course, he was known as the sugar king of Java. One might say he was the sugar king of the South China Sea, who in his early years bought enormous amounts of sugar of superior quality with credit provided by several banks. Who better to embark on land reclamation projects? Kwek Jun Ing, which is a Dutch transliteration of his name, was a Chinese businessman from the Netherlands Indies, originally from Taiwan, which was at that time a Japanese colony, for most of his life a Japanese colony. He established the NV Kwek Hook Tong Handelsmaatschappij, established in Solo, with branches in Yogyakarta, Surabaya, and Semarang in Java, dealing in mainly sugar, rice, and tea. In Hong Kong, Kwek established a company called Ching Siong Company to expand his sugar business in East Asia. And also Ching Siong Land Investment Company, which we are more interested in the context of this paper, an offshoot to build a sugar factory on reclaimed land in North Point, reclaimed territory in North Point. The completed reclaimed land will have godowns and industries necessitating shipping accommodation. On September 5th, 1921, Kwek bought two marine lots, 430 and 431, areas of 435,000 and 462,000 square feet, respectively, from the government, from the Hong Kong government, whose frontage on Shau Ki Wan Road was 1,307 feet long, and agreed to, and I quote, make certain reclamations and construct a sea wall to protect the reclamation. The seawall construction had many stages, as seawalls do all over the world. It involves first dredging out a trench in the soft seabed mud, constructing a foundation by filling the trench with sand or decomposed granite and rubble, and then placing large berm stones, or rather precast concrete blocks, over the foundation. In the end, one has to leave a gap to be completed by government authorities at the last stage of the work. So not everything was in the private developers' hands. They had to rely a lot on the government, even if they were funding it entirely. So Kwek Jun Ing initially gave $300,000 towards this venture, and proceeded on his own to build a rubble mount wall on a slope along the perimeter of the area to be reclaimed, which necessitated piers running out for the berthing of the ships. So it's very complicated and involves a lot of logistics. Kwek Jun Ing closed an agreement with a Dutch company that he already had a relationship with, because he was actually considered a Dutch colonial subject. So this company is very famous and are often employed by various governments across the world to reclaim land, and is the KNMH, which is the Koninklijk Nederlandse Maatschappij van Havenwerken, on August 8, 1922. So he already had a relationship with them, and and he, along with this company, studied the existing plans for the North Point reclamation works and begin construction. He had become familiar with the company back in the Netherlands Indies, Indonesia. So this is a photo of the works done by this company in Hong Kong. When his seawall was completed, was nearly complete at the beginning of 1923, the Hong Kong government decided to continue the development on his property and further eastward. So they kind of went against the agreement, but they did it so easily because they didn't actually owe him anything, and they constructed a perpendicular, vertical, solid blockwork seawall so that ships could lie alongside it, because they realized that the berthing of the ships was being disrupted by Kwek's own land reclamation efforts. On March 23rd, he wrote the Hong Kong government putting forward a concrete proposal which would in fact unify the entire reclamation scheme as a whole even more. So he saw that they were doing this, and then he sought to accommodate them. He proceeded to make amendments to his own plan based on the understanding that the government would carry out a corresponding scheme adjacent to his property. Although the entire aspect of his very extensive and expensive scheme had been altered for the worse without his consent, Kwek good-naturedly agreed this prospect, which he found to be potentially advantageous to him. A word that was often used by him on the condition of a loan of £600,000, $600,000 from the government, although the construction cost him a lot more. So he was very accommodating. And the Hong Kong government was giving him a hard time in contrast. The government agreed, promising to provide engineers necessary and to supervise the construction, and gave him the first installment of $150,000 in January 1926, followed by 3 more such installments, amounting to 600,000 altogether. Kwik then readily altered the designs of his wall. The change of policy actually cost him an additional $1.9 million, amounting to twice the amount he budgeted for the project. Hence, he was shocked when the Hong Kong government decided after the sale to move the road in such a way that he would be deprived of nearly all the potential frontage. Possession of the Shok Yuan Road, crossing the lots, will not be given until the receipt of a letter from the Director of Public Works stating that the area is at Kwik's disposal, so he had to wait. He entered into a series of negotiations with the Hong Kong government and readily brought more land than originally wanted. From 1927 to 1929, the Hong Kong government authorities took pains to find reasons not to pay him by portraying him as a deceptive figure, undeserving of proper compensation. His intentions in helping the British were regarded in a suspicious light, and his finances scrutinized even more. Even his frequent absence from Hong Kong was blamed on him. All this was done to vilify him in the eyes of other members of government administration so as to assuage their guilt, and so that they don't need to compensate him. The Attorney General did not flinch in the face of his demands and decisively dismissed his complaints. In the first place, the Attorney General said, Mr. Kwik entered into the 1923 agreement with his eyes open. Perhaps his eyes were not sufficiently open to all the risks, but the government, who also have been disappointed in their hopes, can scarcely be asked to bear all the burden of his optimism and bad judgment, unquote. Finally, in June 1930, the Governor William Peel recognized the true contributions of Kwik Jun Eng and decided to remit his debt, not wanting to be mired in expensive, long drawn-out litigation with a very wealthy man. He also wanted to move forward with reclamation work east of Kwik's territory. This episode highlighted the high risk that land reclamation projects pose. Kwik was on the losing end, having no say in government planning and not privy to their discussions at all. He only found out things when he saw that they were happening, so he saw the construction was being done and then he found out. No public consultations were done before launch of land reclamation projects. Colonial fiat dictates that the government could do anything. The fact that government authorities mulled over what he had done suggests that they did not want to waste the goodwill of the wealthy class, because they still entertained his requests and listened to his complaints. So they didn't want to squander that because they still need the funding from private enterprise. The success of his own efforts hinged, however, upon government collaboration and cooperation. His completed construction had to be immediately protected from the sea by a modification of the original Nala, a canal made out of concrete to facilitate rapid drainage of water from high ground, a project that could only be carried out by the Hong Kong government. But the Attorney General pointed out that he was paid over $31,000 to build it. So there was this confusion. This confusion indicated that collaborative construction projects were tricky in apportioning funds accurately, and also responsibility for what tasks, because they were all adjoined and they couldn't be separated out. It wasn't a project like that. The success of this part depends on the formation of this wall and so on and so forth. Projects could easily be abandoned due to the high cost, which made it extremely risky at any point. Since its utility could only be measured after it was built, the value of such projects could only be ascertained after they were complete. In 1928, passing the terms in the letters and contracts, the Attorney General distilled the terms to a single line. The only promise which can be extracted is a promise that any future reclamation would be protected by a vertical seawall continuous with Mr. Kwik's. The representation was true and the promise had not been broken, he said. Unclear legislation led to lack of compensation for financiers such as Kwek Jun Eng, and a lack of clarity about role of colonial subjects funds. In 1948, the Treasury in London was preparing to release Hong Kong from its control, pushing the Hong Kong government to exhibit more fiscal responsibility and simultaneously push for more economic development, which of course required more spending. Being one of the least planned British port cities, this was difficult. British town planner Patrick Abercrombie's 24-page report, published a few months later in September 1948, outlined proposals for reclamations alongside provision of a cross-harbour tunnel, railway relocation, removal of military establishments, creation of industrial and residential zones, and development of new towns in rural new territories. Put reclamation in the name of development on the cards, basically. Abercrombie pointed out that the conflict inherent in Hong Kong was between, and I cite from the report, a shortage of land for any sort of urban expansion or quarter, and an unlimited reservoir of possible immigration from mainland China in post-war period. The spike in population and commercial activity in Hong Kong due mainly to the Chinese Civil War from 1927 to 49 between the Kuomintang and Taiwan and the Communist Party of China. After the end of the Japanese occupation in 1945, other people began to return to Hong Kong at a rate of almost 100,000 a month, such that by the end of 1947, the population reached 1.8 million, even more than the pre-war population, which was 1.6 million. Immigration brought about by the Civil War boosted the number of laborers, especially to the new territories on the mainland acquired by British from China in 1898. Prior to the Second World War, some members of the Hong Kong government, specifically members of the New Territories Subcommittee of the Development Committee, believed the impact on resident population of the planned construction of a large airport had to be offset by land reclamation for the purpose of rice fields for 900 coastal villages who would inevitably be displaced from the area. But the governor cited the high cost, 28,000 Hong Kong dollars, 1.7 million pounds. Rather tellingly, the claims for compensation made by various owners of property and land affected by reclamation were taken more seriously, rather than, the claims of coastal villages and also farmers. These claims came up to substantial portion of total cost. Compensation claims are what the British government feared the most. And so they tried to keep it low by cutting out a lot of people from being able to ask for compensation. So these claims came out to a substantial portion of total cost, $8 million against the estimated budget of $18.75 million, about 42.6%. Talk of airport construction or reclaimed land did not take into account compensation and resettlement of these villages at all. After the Second World War, however, the same committee argued that reclamation project had to take into account the burgeoning population in the colony now, considering the rice growing fields which would be destroyed because of the airfield, which is to be built. In many ways, the request was antithetical to the accompanying concern, which was the airport. The absence of a modern, and they keep on using this word modern, because there was an airport, but it wasn't considered a modern airport. And by a modern airport, they mean a large airport with a long runway, at least one long runway. And Governor Mark Young was very intent on establishing the colony as a center of communications. And he was alarmed that Kai Tak Airport, the existing airport at the time, was unable to accommodate transcontinental 4-engined aircraft, forcing a lot of airlines which use these airplanes, such as Pan American Airways and other major airlines, to negotiate with Canton authorities in China for the use of their airfield for such planes. So, they wanted these planes to land in Hong Kong and develop Hong Kong as the hub, the airport hub. The mere possibility of airlines bypassing Hong Kong for China made Mark Young anxious, and against this backdrop, the plight of 900 villages could not compare in his eyes. In this way, expanded land construction and artificial land construction were more destructive than other forms of reclamation, such as offshore reclamation. The fact that the Secretary of State for the Colonies and the Treasury had to be persuaded by local colonial governments to ensure that planned land reclamation projects go through clearly demonstrate that a colony was a unit of a larger scheme, the British Empire, and did not exist independently of it. There was, in fact, a third powerful pillar who was the admiralty, a maritime-based authority responsible for the command of the Royal Navy in Britain and the world, to our empire, that continually challenged the aims of local colonial governments whose authority they actually superseded. Strictly speaking, the sea was in fact their jurisdiction entirely. Thus far, we have seen how within imperial context, land reclamation was not modular, in the sense that it was very much driven by local government's funds, available technology and experts in particular colonies. When the British returned to their colonial possessions with the end of the Japanese occupation, post-war Pacific defense was still fresh in the minds of British officials. And if we recall, they had, of course, fallen. In 1947, the director of dockyards in Hong Kong stated that there were plans to drop to refitting needs for a small overflow from Singapore, half-yearly docking of some cruisers, storing, victualling, and exercise base for the British Pacific Fleet to Singapore. With these new duties in place, after this disastrous fall of the Pacific from a British point of view, any major development would prejudice the Admiralty to more intentionally resist attempts by the Hong Kong government to reclaim the dockyard for commercial purposes. Imperial synchrony was key. Individual colonial projects, especially those of huge magnitude such as land reclamation projects, had to sync with larger imperial schemes. In 1950, the Hong Kong government officially proposed the reclamation of the area abutting Connaught Road Central and the dockyard for commercial development. The reclamation was huge, 388,000 square feet. It was supposed to be bounded by a seawall. And by law, the Admiralty had to approve this project since local naval authorities navigated the very coastal maritime spaces that would surely be transformed by land reclamation. But they were not consulted till the very end. It was almost, from what I can see in the correspondence, the Hong Kong government was very nervous to consult the Admiralty authorities, and left it to the very last minute, and wrote urgent, in all the letters. And there was a lot of back and forth, and the Commodore Superintendent was clearly not happy and sent many curt responses and so on and so forth, and was not happy with the fact that the harbor was changing and that the water might not be deep enough for naval ships to dock in the end, and it was potentially really disastrous for the Hong Kong government. To conclude, different branches of government in various offices based in London, such as the Colonial Office, Foreign Office, and the Treasury, who later became in charge of the CDC, jockeyed for influence and financial resources vis-a-vis authorities based in the colonies. Ultimately, in the case of Hong Kong, security and defense authorities had priority over other sectors since their requirements could not be compromised. Decisions were made in consideration of larger imperial defense frameworks formed by several different kinds of colonies. The entire Pacific from the perspective of the Navy, that included Australia, Malaya, and Singapore at the very least. The relative rigidity of the Admiralty led other agencies to try to skirt around them initially, which is of course unrealistic because at the end of the day, you still have to consult them. Funding by colonial subjects in the form of lotteries and outright lump sum donations by wealthy local residents was sometimes encouraged. But even then, a sense of unease continued to linger as colonial authorities were neither willing to be indebted to colonial subjects nor grant them the same access to developed facilities that they helped build. While different agencies constantly weighed the cost of land reclamation to the point of being at odds with one another, two kinds of costs were not considered, were consistently ignored. And that is, as you might guess, compensation amounts for locals, especially colonial subjects, who lived and worked on or near the coastline, such as fishermen, farmers, and so on, and environmental costs related to immediate and potential deterioration of natural assets due to economic activities wrought by land reclamation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. I just want to encourage all of you to send questions to me within a chat, or you can also, I guess, use the raise hand function. Just to start us off, we have a question from Malcolm Kemp, who asks, was any reclamation attempted during the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong? 1941 to 45, many POWs were utilized for such products. And what did the returning colonial power Britain do about any reclamation, I guess, done by the Japanese at the time? Thank you.
The Japanese also embarked on land reclamation projects, and the British, when they came back, tried to build on it, and they don't see a problem with the fact that, you know, it was another power who did it and stuff like that. They considered the land reclamation projects started by the Japanese as being, from the perspective of engineering, sound, and so they built on these projects that were continued by the Japanese. So yeah, the Japanese were, you know, throughout the empire, spent a lot of resources on infrastructure, not just laborers, which were mostly prisoners of war, as you mentioned, but also a lot of money, because they, you know, they thought that they would be around for a really long time. Yeah, so they continued whatever that the colonial powers did in various places, and also saw a lot of value in land reclamation. Yeah.
Great. Thanks so much. I actually have a sort of somewhat follow-up question and then a completely different question. So my first question was about who exactly labored to do all the reclamation at different moments, and if there were any sort of private reclamations done on really small scale by local Hong Kongers, and how if that was ever an issue for the government, right? So people, and this is, my question is coming out of an example from Bombay, where lots of locals would fill up swampy land to make land for themselves, right? And then try to claim ownership over that land. So if that was ever an issue. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. The laborers were Hong Kongers themselves who were usually living along the coast and might have lost their livelihood as fishermen due to previous land reclamation projects, you know, because across generations there was more and more loss as the British reclaimed more and more land without consulting anybody and without compensation. So, you know, they were still living there. Sometimes they had also lost their homes and they were just squatters, and they will be the laborers working for a pittance in these areas. Land reclamation is also a risky endeavor in terms of fatality, because it's usually dangerous. It involved heavy machinery, heavy vehicles, and because it was so technologically challenging, a lot of people don't know how to operate all these machines and heavy vehicles. And it's high fatality throughout the world in land reclamation. It's only in the recent past that this has not become such an issue. Yeah, but at that time it was still very much an issue. So it is seen as, I mean, the people who worked on these sites were usually people who were desperate for a job to begin with, and usually it's because of dispossession due to earlier land reclamation. Yeah, so they would be those people. In terms of small scale reclamation, yeah, thank you so much for asking that question. I did not see it. I did not see any mention of that being a problem. Because in terms of swampy areas, it wasn't as intense as it was in Bombay or on the other side in the Bay of Bengal. Yeah, it wasn't like that in Hong Kong. And so there wasn't like small scale reclamation projects being done privately by people. Yeah, everything was driven by the taipans, you know, the companies, the huge companies on the shore, on the coast with their huge go downs such as Butterfield and Swire and Jardine Matheson and things like that, and other companies, other British companies, and then, you know, by private individuals like Chater, for example. And then after that, it was the British government who did it, if you know what I mean. So it wasn't like, so the pioneers of land reclamation were not the British government, you know what I mean? Like they did it, you know, when there was the big fire and stuff like that, and they helped. But the main financiers were not them to begin with. It was only in the 20th century that the British government stepped in and did it on a large scale because they could. Because once they apportioned funds for it, then they had a lot of money, way more money than the private companies did. Yeah, and also they had hurt the private companies too, right? Because their go downs were affected because of silt, for example. Like silting is a huge problem because, you know, previously it wasn't, but because of huge land reclamation, so the silt began to wash up to their go down. So then ships couldn't go up to their go downs anymore to unload, and they themselves were affected by this. Yeah, so it was first the private companies and then the British government, but not so much of there was no threat from other people, yeah, on a small scale.
Thanks so much. So we have a question from Stephen Gallagher, who says, first, please thank you for a very interesting talk, and then asks, did the Hung Yi Cook take any part in these consultations and negotiating compensation for villagers in the Northern Territories?
Yeah,
so, I mean,
yeah.
new territories.
Yeah, new territories. Yeah, they did, but it was so careless, you know, the way the British dismissed all claims for compensation when it concerned people who were not white, it seems. So like when the British companies appealed for compensation, they would listen, but not from anybody who was a local Hong Kong person, you know, like a local Chinese person. They wouldn't listen, and they'll be like, oh, you know, I mean, it's a colony, so too bad, you know, we don't compensate people in, say, the straight settlements either, you know, so they have that view that, oh, we don't have to listen to this. But the compensation requests are really interesting because then I can see, you know, what sorts of people were really affected by land reclamation. So usually it's fishermen who fished for various animals. You know, there's fish, clams, sea urchins, and slowly this became, because the ecology of the place began to change also. So certain kinds of fish became just disappeared, you know, because they were so affected by the land reclamation, so disruptive to the environment, such that they went further out into the ocean and were no longer found, you know. So if you are a fisherman, you specialize in certain kinds of fish, then the fact that you can't gain access to that anymore, it already affects your livelihood, of course. So there are all these kinds of things that happened, and the British government did not care about that. So as little as they cared about compensation of these people, right, who depend on the sea for their livelihoods, they cared even less for ecological transformation. Yeah, that was not an issue at all for them. It wasn't on their radar. And any requests for anything of that sort were immediately dismissed, and quite easily dismissed by them. Yeah.
Thank you so much. The next question is by Francis Fung. I would like to see, for the case of Kai Tak, Mr. Ho Kai and Otak undertook the land reclamation as a private project. However, the project was unsuccessful and liquidated in 1924. Are there any comparable private land reclamation projects in Southeast Asia? Thank you.
Hong Kong is the place, you know, throughout the British Empire. Hong Kong is a one place that I saw that was where the reclamation was driven by private enterprise, by both the British companies in the 19th century and by Hong Kongers themselves. And it's quite amazing how it is an exception. Yeah, nowhere else did I see this level of high degree of private enterprise in the process of land reclamation. For example, it doesn't happen in Borneo. It doesn't happen in any of the Caribbean islands. Everything was carried out by the British government, British colonial governments. And, you know, I didn't see it in the settlements. I didn't see it in Singapore. And it's just amazing, you know, how it's only in Hong Kong I see that private enterprise was the driving force for land reclamation projects. It's quite amazing. Yeah, they readily took money from other people, you know what I mean? Like the British authorities elsewhere were very concerned that, oh no, if we give them the opportunity to build something, they might think it's theirs. You know, so they were very concerned about it, they were obsessed about this. But in Hong Kong, not so much. It's like a larger history of Hong Kong, you know, since its inception, it was driven by private enterprise. There's a very different history being due to how it originated and stuff like that. Yeah. In Singapore, for example, in Singapore, where, you know, land reclamation is now considered an extreme story because we increased by 40%, you know, just through land reclamation. It's quite extreme. It began, of course, at the time during the time of the formation, you know, as a British colony in 1819, and it was driven by government, you know, and it was built by conducted by penal laborers from Tamil Nadu mostly, to places like Penang, Singapore, and so on and so forth. Yeah, so it's very different. It's driven by the colonial government, by the EIC, the East India Company government. Yeah, it's very different. But Hong Kong is one place I see that they were the main driving force, and then the British joined. You know, they're like, oh, okay, so they either joined in terms of funding, right, or, you know, at the very least they added to what was before. So it's rare that they completely, as you imply in your question, it's rare that they completely did it on their own. Like, oh, we're going to start over here now. And as you saw in the first slide that I showed, usually it's they join the other reclaimed land. Yeah, so they didn't like pioneer any projects. Yeah, usually.
Thanks so much. Would anyone else like to use the chat or the raise hand function? Yes, please. Chris?
Okay, great. Thanks so much for the truly fascinating talk. I have a ton of questions, but I think the ones I want to ask most burningly are actually sort of one step more general kind of methodological project designy. So, you know, I had the I benefited from hearing your presentation on your previous work last year and so forth, and I'm struck, you know, by sort of the different directions this project goes in. So I guess the first, you know, one question is, I guess just what led you to this sort of project as a focus for your work? Another one is, I know you've spoken to us about Hong Kong specifically today, but I think if I'm correct, that there's a Singapore focus in the broader project. So just to know exactly kind of the different places where land, you mentioned sort of Borneo, etc., and having looked at other places, so how you kind of determine the parameters you were interested in looking at overall. And then I guess as a third sort of methodology related question,
Yeah.
I mean, I think from the Hong Kong presentation, certainly it comes across to me sort of like it's an urban history. It's about the relationships between the city government and different private investors and so on. You know, and there's some, I mean, you know, this is also self-interested in a way as somebody who's thought about going in that direction, but hasn't quite done so yet. Sort of what you see as the benefits and joys, what you see as sort of the challenges of conducting that type of historical investigation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. first, what led me to this project is being a Singaporean. Singapore has changed so much in my lifetime due to land reclamation, and it's quite extreme. The way we take land from our neighbors, right? First of all, from Malaysia, and then Malaysia got angry and told us to stop, and then from Indonesia, from the outer islands near Singapore, and then Jakarta found out and told them to stop, and then from the Philippines, and they also decided to stop because it was literally giving your land away, and it was very disturbing for a lot of people, especially the governments. Even if the outlying areas, on the margins were keen on doing it. In contrast, and then I watched this documentary, a very short documentary produced by the Atlantic on how Singapore takes sand from Vietnam and Cambodia and the destruction wrought on their coastlines, especially in the swampy areas, which is of course ecologically hugely fertile and very productive for a lot of people living in the region. They invited, the producer of the documentary invited the Cambodian lady whose family was very much affected by this to Singapore to look at Marina Bay Sands. And the whole area wasn't around when I was growing up. And, it was only built in the early 2000s, and finished in 2007. So, it's kind of amazing that the Singapore skyline associated with the thing that has become the logo of Singapore now due to, popularity of films such as Crazy Rich Asians was not around for the most part of my life. So it's kind of amazing to me. I don't have any attachment to this place, to the skyline, because it wasn't there, and yet that's considered what is Singapore now. Well, that's what's exported, this image. And it's all on reclaimed land. And, it's considered like of course, it's an awesome, amazing engineering feat, right? And so I was very much struck by that because I live in a place where there is extreme land reclamation going on, still going on, not backing down. And I was, the airport is mostly built on reclaimed land. So in that sense, the Singapore story and the Hong Kong story is very much is alike. I mean, obviously Hong Kong is way bigger than Singapore, but it's alike in the sense that the airport is seen as like this emblem, of modernity, of connection, right? Of connectivity, of a successful network, of being a successful hub, right? And that's what both the people of Hong Kong and the British colonial government recognized and was obsessed with. One thing that I was struck by while researching for this project was how the British in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and 80s continuously resented the fact that a lot of local Hong Kongers enjoyed going to the airport for fun, not to fly out, but just to hang out, like to see the planes, because it is pretty, it's nice to see and dream of going to faraway places. And people just hang out at airports, here too in Singapore. So it's not seen as like a place that you go to where you are traveling for, and just travel. It's just also a place for you to have a picnic and sit beside the runway, beyond the fence, and look at the planes taking off and landing, because it's kind of cool, right? And they hugely resented that. And I see that as a sign of them, another evidence of the British being resentful that Hong Kongers derive joy from these sorts of infrastructure that was supposed to only benefit colonial coffers, if you know what I mean, because of course it leads to wear and tear of the facilities of the airport, right? The more the people come, because they come with their families and they hang out and stuff like that. And so they were like, oh, if only they're not here. You know what I mean? Like, if only these people are not here. If only the airport is like this pristine space for people who should travel, people who are mobile, to travel, to be mobile. But these local Hong Kongers, like, why are they here? You know, so it's very, it's a, you know, it's obviously it's very ugly, right? It's a very ugly phenomenon that local Hong Kongers are regarded as being these people who should not be seen in these places, which are not meant, is not meant for them, you know, that sort of thing. So yeah, you know, I see that as a, it's like an ongoing thing. And obviously from 65 to the 80s, we have, here in Singapore, we have a very different journey, and it's a, culturally, yes, the airport is a place where people go to hang out also. But of course, you know, it's seen as like with pride, you know what I mean? Like we build this and stuff like that. So it's a very different milieu, you know, one being colonial, one being national, and a mark of pride, you know, and all built on reclaimed land too, right? So I see that as being very jarring and extremely interesting as a result. The other, so I was very much drawn to this project because I saw how extreme land reclamation is, how my environment has changed so much, such that I don't have any connection to, I would say, 20% of the territory that is now Singapore, because I didn't grow up looking at that, looking at these places. The other reason, the other thing that led me to this project is that I saw the colonial obsession with places that were jurisdictionally unproblematic. So the colonialists, they were very much annoyed by anything that is hazy or gray, you know, and they were like, oh, compensation, you know, they hated that word. You know, it means that that place has had people who are living on it, who are occupying it, who thought that they had jurisdiction over that place and still continue to have jurisdiction, right, after colonial occupation. So they deeply resented this and tried to cut against it. They tried to reduce this phenomenon. They tried to minimize potential claims of compensation to compensation. And they saw in this extreme alternative of land reclamation a release from that, which is land reclamation. As amazing as that sounds, because it's hugely expensive, it's so, in terms of engineering, it's so hard to do and stuff like that, right? And but that's how much they were driven, you know what I mean? Such that they were like, oh, why can't we just conquer the sea and we're done with this? Nobody would say anything because we built it and nobody was living there, right? And so on and so forth. You see what I mean? So that's how much they were hounded. They felt so hounded by claims of compensation. Even in places like, you know, to pick an extreme jurisdiction, even in places like Singapore, which is supposedly uninhabited, legally speaking. Of course, it wasn't uninhabited, but legally speaking, they made a case, right? They just made a case that there was no one here. They had to they were like, yeah, but it wasn't there. And so they could claim something. So maybe we won't call it compensation, but we have to give them something. We have to appease them in some way. So there's, even in places which are considered terra nullius, either literally or not, they had to listen to requests for compensation. So they wanted to find a place that was jurisdictionally pure. And of course, you know, my story in the book I'm writing is that land reclamation did not give them that, because there were so many claims to compensation still, because the sea was not jurisdictionally pure at all. You know, there's so many claims to it, you know, because so many people depended on it for their livelihood. And even before UNCLOS came into being, there were many claims from various quarters. Yeah, either in terms of like financial stakeholders, right? Or, you know, like I said, the people who depended on the water for their livelihood and were living there and so on and so forth. Even if they were colonial subjects, there's still some claim that they could make repeatedly. Yeah. So that was those two reasons are what drove me to this project.
Thank you so much. Well, I think this idea of being jurisdictionally pure, this aspiration for this, right? This is absolutely fascinating, especially when you put that against a kind of competing body of the admiralty, right? Who are saying, no, this is our space. We need it for security and mobility of the sea. Amazing.
Yeah.
I just had, and again, please, anyone use the raise hand function or write me in the chat. I just had one question that, it's really out of my geological lack of expertise, but how much can one build on reclaimed land, in the sense that, and again, this is coming out of my experience studying Bombay, Mumbai, is that reclaimed land, you can't necessarily build a high rise on it because the land is not as steady, perhaps. Or, what are the possible, were there any fears about changing climate at any moment in the 20th century, or, that the land would be unstable somehow? Thank you.
Yeah. So in the beginning, there was a lot of worry and anxiety that, buildings are going to sink one day, even if you build on it, and stuff like that. But it's not like that at all. Reclaimed land is very sturdy, and whole towns are built on reclaimed land across the world, and full of high-rise complexes and so on. It's not a problem. The problem is, there is a problem, and the problem is not what we think it is. And it is that reclaimed land tend to be low-lying areas, and therefore are now, in the 21st century, prone to risk of flooding. Yeah, it wasn't a problem before, even though they were, of course, low-lying areas. But now, because of the climate crisis, they are all prone to flooding. Yeah, and I was struck by how much the United Nations, and also, say, the British Empire, the British colonial powers, engaged the expertise of the Dutch in land reclamation projects across the world. And they did so because of the belief, right, that the Dutch had for thousands of years reclaimed their own land, because their land is in the Netherlands, below sea level, right? So in that sense, it's very much an international affair. So whenever you have a land reclamation project, it is usually by default an international affair. So I'm not just talking about Singapore, which is already extreme because we don't have any land to, we don't have any hills or whatever to level anymore. So all we get is land from somewhere else, right, from neighboring countries, leading to a conflict and stuff like that. It's not just that, but it's also that the engineers tend to be from all over the world. It started out with the Dutch because they were seen, they were almost like to a stereotype, profile as people who were experts in land reclamation. And it was because of this. It was because it was, low-lying area and stuff like that. And it was a huge success for several decades. And it's like, yes, we did it. We managed to do this expensive thing, and now whole towns are built on it, and other kinds of infrastructure as well. But now it is very, very much a problem because they are all low-lying areas. Almost all are below sea level. Yeah, the highest they come in across the world is at sea level, like 0. Yeah, so it's very much a problem, and it's not seen. It is not seen as a viable project for residential living anymore because of that. So mostly, like, for example, in the Arab Gulf countries, they do it mostly for like hotels and malls and stuff like that. So it's not for like, people don't do it to live, like to create housing for people anymore, if you know what I mean. The ones that are already been built, yeah, they still go on, but the price of property on reclaimed land depreciate a lot in the past 20 years. Yeah, it's quite amazing.
Yeah, that's actually really, really interesting. And also I would imagine, and you had mentioned this earlier in your talk, that the more land is reclaimed, it also affects the property values of people who are, behind, right? If it is a harbor front, then you've removed the harbor front from somebody else. Yeah, absolutely fascinating. Thanks. Would anyone else like to ask a question or have a comment? Oh, Chris, please.
Well, I've always got more questions, so if nobody else asks them, then they'll have to hear from me. But I just wanted to, I know I asked a ton of questions the first time around, but I actually wanted to follow up on another aspect of it, which is sort of the urban governance kind of the like urban history element of this, because I was, I sort of right, in one sense, I suppose land reclamation is sort of, it was sort of interesting to me that it's like it's a very high intensity, high stakes issue of a big urban investment project with some really peculiar characteristics or something like that, right? And then of course run through the particularly complicated scenario, which is, the sort of colonial urban governance of Hong Kong or Singapore, above and beyond like the already complicated urban governance of any city. And then it seems like, there are certain periodizations. You noted kind of the post-World War II era where the government in London gets more concerned, and the War Department, obviously, this is something it wasn't before. So I guess I'm wondering, so part of it is this sort of original question, kind of how have you, what do you find the kind of challenges, but also the sort of insights of doing sort of urban governance history, if it's fair, if you agree with me that it's fair to kind of characterize it as that. And then also, can you see it? Do you see it in your own mind as kind of an exact, one particular lens through which we can think about longer term trends in, I guess, within the British Empire of sort of the space afforded to these particular colonies that were also cities, or how you think about that? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that question. One thing that I noticed while researching for this project is that there's this idea that people have of coastal areas should be expanded upon, not inward, not inland, but outwards into the sea. So the sea is what drove people to reclaim land. It's not more land that they want. It's because they want more access to the sea, if you know what I mean. It's really ironic. It's like you would think that it's like, oh, you want more land, don't you? It's not like that at all. It's that they want more access to the sea. It's like, oh, we want more frontage, we want more coastal areas. We want more access to either in terms of business or in terms of recreation, if you know what I mean. So it is very interesting, you know what I mean? Because, for example, the airport, right? It's because they don't want you to, like, the state doesn't want other planes to fly too much over the land, you know what I mean? They want other, especially other airlines, which is not the national carrier, to simply land, like zoop, just land at the airport and not fly too much over, say, Singapore or something like that. So they want access to the sea, and that's what it is. So it's more like you want to extend the coastal line, the perimeter of the sea, so that more things be done on the water, but whatever that you want, be it for commercial purposes or for recreation and stuff like that. Because now for commercial, it's not, the thing to do is not to have go downs or stuff like that anymore, right? On the coast. So it's more like for, as you can see in the, the Arab Gulf states like Qatar and Abu Dhabi and Dubai, they are fans of different shapes, right? The islands could take, like a palm tree and so on and so forth. And from the design, people say, oh, it's so spectacular, it's awesome, blah, blah, blah. But actually, when you look at the design, it's to extend the length of the coast, you know what I mean? So that as many people could have access to the sea as possible, right? Such that you can have like a personal view of the sea, a vista to the sea, right? And just come out of your hotel room and there you go, right? And that's your right for the week or something like that, direct access to the sea. And then your neighbor, right, beside you has the same access to the same length of the beach and stuff like that. Yeah, so there's that. And when we think about land reclamation, it is poetic in a sense because they are approached from the sea. So they are not, one does not reclaim land from land anymore. So starting from the early 20th century, one conducts sound, starting from the late 19th century, one conducts soundings from the sea, which is always how it has been done. But the difference is that now one also reclaims land from there. So one is able to, due to new technology, one is able to reclaim land from where the soundings are done. So it comes to you. Like imagine if you're standing on shore, the land reclamation now goes from the place, the limit of reclaimed land to you on the shore. So if you're able to gain access to any land reclamation process today, that's how it's done. You can see that, oh, that's the extent of the reclaimed land. Yeah. So it's an approach from the sea. Yeah, on both levels. Yeah. So to me, that's what makes it special. Especially now, in the past, in 1842 and so on and so forth, it was done from the shore. So they kept filling and filling and filling, and then they finish at some point. But now no more. Now because of technology, that's how it's done. Yeah. So back to your question back to your point about urban history, right? Yeah. So the urban history is very particular. Yeah, I'm glad you brought it up because it's coastal urban history, if you know what I mean. It's a very port city kind of phenomenon. It's a very coastal phenomenon. It's almost like we have to approach coastal urban areas on its own. Different from, say, the rest of the country or the rest of the island. I mean, Singapore and Hong Kong, I guess, are two extreme examples. Actually, they're not good examples because they don't have like a hinterland or whatever. But places like Borneo, for example, is huge. Yeah, so like the coast of Borneo, the west coast of Borneo has a lot more in common with, say, Singapore than the rest of Borneo. You know what I mean? Yeah. So it's a very coastal urban history phenomenon. Yeah.
Excellent. We actually have a kind of two-part question from Eileen Rondilla. She says, have there been any organized movements from the local peoples whose lives were affected by the reclamation?
Yeah.
And then her second question is, how are supranational organizations reacting to the conflicting claims resulting from land reclamations vis-a-vis the nation state? Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, so the land reclamation today is hugely, there's consensus that they are hugely disastrous, both in terms of affecting the livelihoods of people who are living on the shore and on the coast for generations sometimes, and also for the environment. And of course, both are linked, right? Yeah. And it's becoming more and more a possibility for a lot of people. And so they are very common now throughout the world. And the people who can afford it, the places that can afford it are ramping up their efforts, which is ironic considering that the climate crisis is wreaking havoc too, right, on the areas that are already reclaimed. But people still do it. And it's hugely disastrous for everyone involved. And there are always groups of people organizing themselves in order to fight for their rights. And they appeal on both counts, which I just mentioned, both on their own accounts, like, you are destroying the place that I'm attached to, the place that maybe I depend on for my life and stuff like that. And also on account of ecology and the natural environment and stuff like that, because things are completely destroyed, like coral reefs, for example. Like, for example, right now, Penang has this massive land reclamation scheme driven by private enterprise, approved by the Malaysian government. And none of the people of Penang will benefit from it. It's pretty extreme because the entities who are funding it are private enterprises, and they're going to build private property and hotels and resorts and stuff like that. So it will not benefit the people of Penang directly, if you know what I mean. In fact, they can only see that it will be bad, and for good reason, of course. In terms of supranational involvement and, to mitigate any kind of disruption, it is very limited. And there are supranational organizations which help people on the ground, but because they come up against national governments, right? And in terms of jurisdiction, they don't have a say. They can't do much except to influence public opinion and educate people, educate the governments and stuff like that. But beyond that, it is very difficult. It is very much a problem today. Yeah, it's not decreasing as a method of expansion of territory. In fact, it's becoming more and more popular, unfortunately. Yeah.
Thanks so much. We think we have one last question. It's quite very interesting question from Christopher Sabla. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. A big thank you again for presenting this work to the Hong Kong audience. And the question is related to Christopher Roberts' question about historical scale. So obviously this is a project that engages at multiple levels, which makes it so rich. But do you find it challenging to respond to the different historiographies to which this history relates at the same time with their different priorities, sometimes proprietary attitudes, urban, colonial, global, international, not to mention the way different subfields like legal and colonial history relate to these scales?
Yeah.
So do you have any methodological insights on how to manage multiple scales at the same time? Good question.
Thank you, Chris, for this question. Yes, it is very challenging because each colony has its own history and its own post-colonial history as well, which I intend to address in my book. And it's very much, it's very, as a historian, I pay attention to historical context. And the one thing that that runs through, there are threads that run through the entire empire. One is that they all are dependent on offices in London to grant funds, and increasingly, as in the course of the 20th century becomes more and more of an issue. It seems that colonial governments used to be more independent, but due to increasing centralization and due to the rising cost of land reclamation, they were more and more dependent on London, on offices in London who had their own take, and also their lands is larger and stuff like that. And the other thing is that, as I said to Chris Roberts just now, a lot of these places that I look at, their identity is as coastal urban areas. Yeah, they might be port cities or not, but they all share the same identity, as far as I can see, in that the coast is super important rather than the inland territory that is just behind this coast, if you know what I mean. The water is the thing that makes it important. Yeah, land reclamation is driven by the desire to conquer watery spaces and extend, the asset remains the water, if you know what I mean. Yeah. So yes, that's how I managed in coming out of a narrative. That's how I manage historical scale.
So I think we're just about out of time. I want to say a big thank you to Professor Yahaya for her amazing talk, and really can't wait for this new book to come out. And I highly recommend for any of you really interested in ideas of jurisdiction in Southeast Asia to look at Professor's first book, Fluid Jurisdictions. And please stay tuned for more talks from the Transnational Legal History Group. And thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Take care, and a big virtual applause.